Hi, this is Park. And before we get started, I just want to ask you a quick question. Have you had a chance to test the strength of your brand story yet? You can do it for free over at StoryCycleGenie.ai. On the homepage, you're going to see the little red button there. That's our brand story grader. Click on that, give it your name, your email address, and the URL of the website that you want it to review. Under 60 seconds, you're going to get a grade from A+ to F- and a 14-point storytelling assessment that validates what you're doing well, reveals gaps you can quickly fix, and even inspire you with new ways to tell your story. Now, it's important because today's guest, she's amazing. And she, later in the show, takes me to my $1 million story, the whole reason why we built the StoryCycle Genie in the first place. You're going to want to hear that because you can use how she coaches me to create your $1 million story. You're going to love it. So you might want to press pause right now, jump over to StoryCycleGenie.ai, get your brand story graded for free, and then come back and hear our amazing guest for you today.
What I call it is story alchemy and interview alchemy, because I believe that stories not only have the power to transform how the world sees you, but they have the power to transform how you see yourself.
I want our brand stories to actually move people, not just inform them. And if you are willing to go beyond the polished, performative version of yourself to the authentic truth underneath, then you will command the kind of fascinated attention that turns audiences into devoted clients. But you're frustrated because every storytelling guru is telling you to be more vulnerable, more transparent, more raw. And it's starting to feel like a performance of authenticity, which is just another kind of performance. Hello and welcome to the Business of Story. As you know, I am Park Howell. Today's guest is Elizabeth Brett. She's a former NBC reporter, creator of Story Alchemy, and a woman who nearly drowned in the ocean with her daughter and emerged completely reborn. She'll show you how to find your $1 million story, apply the sovereignty filter to what you share, and step into the identity-level storytelling that makes you impossible to replicate. You are going to love this episode. I'm so glad you're here with us today. Let's get after it. Hello, Elizabeth. Welcome to the show.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
This is going to be great because we're going to talk about your approach to finding your $1 million story that really brings, your authority and your authenticness to the world. So I'm especially considering your background with NBC reporting and how that all plays into it. So, where do we even begin? Well, we will begin with, I know you're in Austin, Texas, where our son and daughter and granddaughter are. Love it out there. And,
yes.
When have you been there a long time? Because you, with NBC, were probably out on the East Coast covering lots of stuff.
Yeah, so I actually my career slowly took me west. So I started in Albany, New York, and then I worked in Columbus, Ohio, and then my last job with NBC was in Houston. In Texas. So that's what actually brought me to Texas. And when I left news and became a recovering TV news reporter, I quickly moved to Austin because I'd fallen in love with it. I loved the energy here. It was a beautiful place. My family's all still East Coast, but for me, this was a new place to call home. And I actually thought I would just be stopping by, and then met my husband a couple of months later, and here I am, still like 15 years later, something like that.
That's awesome. Now, I studied communications at Washington State University, and they have a very, very good communications program. In fact, it's the Edward R. Murrow School of Communication. That guy actually went there way back when. And I knew, and this was a long time ago I went there, but I had a lot of friends that were in broadcast journalism. And of course, they were aspiring anchors and broadcast reporters. And I don't think think any of them actually landed that. It's a tough job. Did you study broadcast journalism and then got a job right out of school, or what was your career trajectory there?
Well, I grew up in a newsroom. My dad was an anchor for NBC in Manhattan. So from the time I was 2, I was in newsrooms.
Wait a minute, what was his
And
name?
Chuck Scarborough, he just
Chuck
retired
Scarborough.
after
Okay.
50 years as a reporter for WNBC or an anchor for WNBC.
Wow.
And so I really had a taste of it young.
Mm-hmm.
And I really actually resisted it. So I didn't think I would go into news. I went to a liberal arts college where they didn't have a degree in journalism or communications. I studied art history and political science. But when I graduated from college, I had this choice. I was either going to go into the Peace Corps or I was going to try journalism. And I thought, let me just check that box. Let me just,
Mm-hmm.
do it to see if I love it or I hate it. And I fell in love with the storytelling. I fell in love with interviewing people and learning their stories and how um, how different every single day was and how exciting it was to not even know. You went in every day not knowing what your day was going to bring. And I loved breaking news. I loved the stories that I got to develop over months. And so it was really a beautiful way for me to find my own relationship with it after growing up with a dad who'd been in the business for a very long time. And something that we actually really bonded over. We would talk almost daily about, how our stories were that day or what came out of our time in the newsroom. And it was just a beautiful way for us to connect.
And did he push you in that direction or encourage you?
110% Park. This was not, in his mind, there was no other option. And he actually, when I want to say I was 14 or 15 years old, maybe not even that old. He took me in for Take Our Daughters to Work Day. Do you know what that is?
Mm-hmm.
It's
Oh,
a day with,
yeah.
and so he brought me in, and he thought it would be fun if I wanted for me to interview some kids, and I was all about it. I thought it was so cool. And then I asked if I could. I'd seen him do millions of stories at that time, so I asked if I could do a little, walk and talk. And so they let me do that, and then not long before we were set to, I did put a whole package together where I even did the voiceover for the package. I put the interviews together. So I had this whole story that was going to air. And then not long before the newscast, he said, do you want to introduce your story live on air? And he told me later, we were going back through this right before he retired. And he said, right before, like had you sitting up there next to me. It was maybe 5 seconds before we were live. And I thought, what have I done? I'm putting my daughter on air in the largest TV market. She's never done anything like this. But of course, it went great. And I feel like that was the moment that sealed it for him, that he really, really did encourage me and want to push me into trying it at least.
And you were 15 at that point, so you tried it, you
Yeah.
loved it, but when you went into university, you were like, no, maybe I'll do something else other than broadcast journalism.
Yeah, I loved the idea of a liberal arts education, and I was just a free spirit, Park. And so at that point, I didn't feel like I needed to be so focused on the exact thing that I wanted to do for the rest of my life. I was really just open to the experiences that I was going to have in college.
Yeah. So I've always wondered, and when I was reading through your bio, I just was very eager to ask you this next question.
Yeah.
So you've got to think on your feet as a storyteller in broadcast journalism, right? And you get what is a big, complex story comes rolling in, and you look at it and you're like, oh gosh, this could be a 5 to 7 to 10 minute thing. I've got to boil down to 1 minute or 90 seconds.
Yeah.
So for our listeners who are business people and they are trying to take a complex message and boil it down to a 1 minute to a 1.5 minute story, what advice would you give them?
Oh, I love this. So, couple things. So, the most important thing for me as I was learning was practicing, was recognizing how to get to the essence quickly. And a lot of times what that is the emotional essence of the story. So understanding where you are taking people emotionally. And what I have come to develop over time is what I call the story roadmap. And this is a way where you can actually map out your story without it feeling scripted. And you can use it almost like an accordion where it can be as long or as short as you want it to. But really, what you're wanting to do is understand where you're going to begin the story, what the transformation is, that big emotional piece that happens in the story, that golden insight you get from that emotion, and then the end of the story. And so, if you just know where you're going to start people, where you're going to ultimately take them, and the big shift that happens in the story, those are the three really essential pieces that then you can use, and you can make it 30 seconds, you can make it 30 minutes.
It's the three-act structure of story, right? Setup,
Mhm.
problem,
Yep.
transformation,
Yep.
change, conflict, whatever, and
Yep.
then resolution, that aha moment that we get as human beings. Storytelling aids, as I affectionately call ourselves, to make
I love that.
understanding about what just happened. Now, you say you start with the beginning, and of course, every story starts with the beginning, but do you think about first, really, what is my end game? Where do I want to take my audience with this story in the
Mhm.
conclusion, and then build backwards to that? Start with the
Mhm.
beginning, sets up the transformation. You've got the surprise, the plot shift, and then the
Mhm.
aha moment at the end.
Yeah, and again, for where I like to start is, of course, where are we taking them? What is the mission of this story really? And then I like to go to that emotional piece next, the heart of the story, the soul of the story, which is that transformation you're going to take them through. And I feel like the beginning is a really fun place to play because there are probably dozens of ways you could start. And that's where I really love to allow for who am I speaking to specifically. It might be different if I'm doing this in front of a group of women over lunch versus a board meeting, right? It might just feel different for those different audiences or whomever I'm in front of. And the opening actually can be an amazing place to always get to be in relationship with how present you are to the story. And this is one of the things that I see happening over and over again is, you know, a lot of people have a story that they know is a great story for them to tell for their work, but it starts to feel stale when they've been telling it over and over again. I'm sure you've had a lot of
Oh,
people
yeah.
tell you that too. And, one of the ways we can really stay fresh and stay present with it is to just tap back in, to become really present with the story as it happened in your life. So coming back into the presence of like when I was going through this, how was I feeling? But also, where are you now? And what is the best way in for that moment for that audience? And so
Mm.
allowing there to be wiggle room with the starting point
Yeah.
can be really fun.
Now, with the notes you sent over to me, you mentioned an anecdote that happened to you, again, as a young broadcast journalist, where it sounded like you were very, anal when it came down to, man, I got to hit my mark. I've got to say all the right things. I've got to look into the camera. I've got to hit every beat and then wrap it up. And at one point, I think you said you had an editor that came to you and said, great story, but do you remember that?
Mhm. Um, you know, I don't remember that.
It
That's
was
very interesting.
in your note, it was said he loved the story, but it lacked emotion.
Mm,
And you said you had
mm,
this aha moment, like you needed to bring more of yourself to it.
mm. Well, it's very interesting that you say that because this is something that I have been reflecting on this week is I've been talking a lot about performance and how we all are taught to perform. We're taught to play roles. And especially as a TV news reporter, I came right out of college, 22 years old. And the first person I met with was a voice coach to teach me how to sound more like an authority, right? So I learned how to use my voice to sound more like an authority. And then I had someone who told me how I should wear my hair. I kept it short and straight and looking very sophisticated and like an authority again. And then throughout my career, I had these consultants who were talking about, how to look the part. So what should I wear? What colors were good on me? And again, what was my makeup doing? It was all very superficial about how I sounded and how I looked. And there was very little that was actually about the heart of the stories. And it was very little about the actual emotion in the stories. And that is where I feel like the real work is understanding how to bring yourself and your emotion into the story, how to connect with the emotion so that you can have that experience with your audience.
Yeah. So how long were you a reporter, and what transitioned you into what you're doing now?
Yeah. So I worked for NBC. I was right out of college, worked there for almost a decade. And then again, moving up in my markets and having all these different experiences in these different places. And then I had a really big heartbreak, one that shattered everything, including my whole path forward in my career because all of a sudden I was asking, is this really what I want? Is this really what I want to do? And I knew that I wanted to have a family. I knew that I wanted to, have a quote unquote normal life where I was doing things at normal times. And in news, a lot of the time I was, up at 3 a.m. to do the morning shift, or I was staying until midnight because I was on the late shift. And so a lot of those questions ended up, I really ended up with the realization that I no longer thought that it was worth it. The emotional toll it was taking on me, and I really wanted to explore what it would feel like to move in a different direction with my career. And so I decided at the time to leave news. And I had this idea of creating a business to help women get over heartbreak. And the thing I
Now, when
knew
you're
how to
talking about heartbreak, are you talking about romantic heartbreak?
Yeah, I'd
Okay,
just
all
gone
right.
through this terrible breakup. I
Uh-huh.
just had this experience where my whole world was shattered. And I did this little thing. I sent myself flowers and I put a note on it that said, "Girl, don't even be sad about a guy who wouldn't send you these." Right? And
Wow.
that little that little act really woke me up, and it changed the trajectory of my grief and my mourning. And I decided that it would be really cool to create something for other women going through heartbreak and their friends to be able to help them in the same way. And so what I did with that, though, what I knew was my genius was getting interviews and doing interviews. And so I ended up being on the Today Show and the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and getting a lot of interviews about this new path that I was on. And I went in as a relationship expert, and I got to, have all these cool experiences, and people were, of course, hearing my story. And it was the first time that I had ever shared my own story, because for so many years I had been really learning the art of sharing other people's stories. And
Mhm.
I had this whole different experience when it was mine, when it was so personal. And it was beautiful. And that was what got me really fascinated by how people are sharing their own stories. And as I was
Interesting.
doing
Huh.
that, yeah, as I was doing that, people started asking me, "Could you help me? I've got this appearance coming up," or "How would you share my story?" And so this naturally morphed out of that.
Gotcha. And so was it because of your standing as a national broadcast journalist, the heartbreak, because everybody goes through heartbreak, right?
Mhm.
You're not
Sure.
unique to that. Everybody experiences it. But was it because of the connections that you had in network news that they saw you go through it? What's happening? Here's a celebrity of sorts going through it. And is that how you got on those big shows, Today shows, and wherever to tell your story?
Hmm. Well, I feel like there's probably several reasons. That's definitely one of them. The other things are I knew how to pitch, and I also was a great interview. So I would do one, and then I'd be able to take that interview and send that off to the next one. Um, I think also what I was doing at the time, it doesn't sound incredibly revolutionary now, but at the time it was. I had a way that women could receive text messages. They could sign up to receive these texts that were, over a certain period of time, and they were these little pick-me-ups. And
Mhm.
I had a whole, it's so basic now, but that was actually completely revolutionary back then to have text messages going to customers, and we kind
Mhm.
of had to hack it together. It was not something that was readily available. And I had a whole way of, kind of course online for them. And so I feel like it was probably a combination of the approach that I had that was unique and the skill set that I brought.
Yeah.
And then, of course, yes, the relationships always help.
So how long have you been doing this, and how would you define exactly what it is you do?
Yes. So I would say that I was when I left news, it was 15 years ago. When I first started working with women on messaging and media training specifically, it was about 13 years ago. The iteration that I am doing now, which I would really say is the soul level storytelling. I work with women on really understanding the power of their authentic voice through their stories and through interviews. And what I call it is story alchemy and interview alchemy, because I believe that stories not only have the power to transform how the world sees you, but they have the power to transform how you see yourself. And so this journey, this iteration of it actually happened after a near death experience I had in the ocean with my daughter
Oh,
a
wow.
couple of
Well,
years ago now.
what happened?
It was a normal day. We were at our favorite beach. Every summer, we've gone to the same beach off of Long Island, Crider Beach. It has, velvet soft sand, and it's interesting there because the shelf changes all the time. It's not incredibly calm. You're kind of always looking. It can be the currents can be pretty strong. And my daughter at the time, I want to say she was 8, and she was about 60 pounds. Great swimmer, loves the water, loves the ocean, and has been in it since she was born, basically. And my cousin and my son were also there, and we all went out to swim. And we'd been out for a while. I could tell that she was starting to get a little tired. My son and my cousin kind of hollered that they were going in. And as she began to show signs of tiring, I started to um, begin to look for, is now a good time to go back in? And there were 3 waves coming for us, like just a set of waves. And so I told her we had to go under, and so we went under the first one, and as we came back up, I could feel her starting to pull on my shoulder, and so we had the other one coming right behind it, so we went under again, came back up, and after that 3rd one, I was thinking, "Okay, we'll go right in." But there was another set coming, and so in that moment, I began to calculate. how long I felt like I could actually continue swimming and holding her up before going back in. And it was a very primal experience where, we got under the next wave. And I remember feeling like it was pure survival. I was no longer able to, do anything but be focused on getting up and out of the water when we needed to. And I let out some kind of scream like, I can't hold her. Amazingly, my cousin was not too far away. He could hear me. He heard me make the noise. He is a former lifeguard. He is 6'5", so he could actually
Nice.
reach the bottom longer than I'm only
Mhm.
5'5". And so he managed to come back in. And I remember the moment where I handed her to him and I knew she was safe. I knew in that moment that she was going to make it. And it was like I had nothing left and I completely surrendered. I completely let go. And I remember saying to the water, like everything that I'd been fighting with, all of that energy, it just was gone. And I remember saying to the water, take me home. And I didn't know in that moment if I was going to make it back to the beach or if the ocean was just going to take me. And the next thing I remember was crawling on my hands and feet, like feeling the sand under my hands. I, I looking back, I don't know if that was 30 seconds or 20 minutes. I'm sure it was I'm sure it was closer to a minute. But that feeling of the sand under my fingers, I couldn't speak. I just turned around. I looked back at the water, and it would take weeks and months to truly understand the impact of those moments. But I knew in that instant that the woman who had gone into the water that day with her daughter was gone. And there was a new version of me that had emerged from the water. And the biggest feeling I had then was that performing in any way was no longer an option. That pretending or playing a role or doing anything to quote unquote be professional or successful was no longer on the table. That from this point forward, it was about doing my soul work. It was about, really being present in every moment for my kids. It was really about prioritizing what mattered to me and creating a life around that. And my work also ended up shifting, became much more about authenticity, about understanding the power of your unique voice, right? It wasn't as much about like, I'm going to give you these specific strategies to follow. I'm going to write things in this specific way. And it became much more about let's uncover the genius that has always been there. Let's do it in a way that only you can.
Mhm. It's almost a baptism, wasn't it, for you?
Yes, it's exactly what it was, an anointing, a baptism. And I had spent 5 years prior to that deep in sacred feminine work where I had learned all about, things like soul alchemy and archetypal frequencies. And I had learned the art of anointing. And so I had been doing this very deep inner work. This very deep inner work that was all about transformation. And in that moment, I know that's why I was able to have that perspective, why I knew instantly that this was a shedding of the old version of me, that I had been reborn, I had been baptized into this new version of who I was, and that everything would shift as a result.
Is this where the title of your book, Story Shift, came from?
Yeah. Yeah, the story shift is actually an offer that I have on the website, and it's really where Story Alchemy came from. That
Okay.
is the deep, what I would say, the marriage of the inner narrative and the outer story work.
The
Because what I
story
have
you're telling
found,
yourself versus how you're actually
yes,
showing up in the world.
yes, it's those inner stories, and this is what I actually looking back, it's always been this way. I had just never named it. But the work that I do with women over and over again with these incredibly, like, these exceptional, brilliant women who are complete badasses in their field. The work that we end up doing around storytelling, so much of it ends up in how they see themselves, what they're giving themselves permission to do, stories they have around who they have to be, how they have to perform, right? And so when we can break all of that down, when we can actually, remove those layers and masks, that's when they can actually get to their authentic voice. It's something I like to call their soul voice because it's not from the mind, it's not from the intellect. We've all been so trained in how to do that. This is from something much deeper. It is from something that's, for us women, I say it's in our womb space, it's in our
Mhm.
heart space, it's somewhere much lower in the body. And it's that innate wisdom that we get to speak from, which has to it requires you to stop looking at the experts for how to do it and what to do. Much more about turning inward.
Yeah, I see that a lot too, especially when I'm on LinkedIn and I'm looking at the experts and you need to do this and here's how you handle LinkedIn and do that. And your podcast should be no longer than 20 minutes because no one's going to listen and blah, blah. And I listened to them a lot for a long time when I started Business
Mhm.
of Story, trying to understand this whole world. And boy, just recently I've come to it thinking to myself, what a bunch of hooey. I've, spent 40 years in the branding marketing world. I have learned from failures. I've learned from successes. I've learned from brilliant people. I've stood on the shoulders of giants, as they said. I've read and I've watched and I've listened and I've done all this stuff, but you got to make it your own. You
Yes.
you got to bat away 90% of that stuff, and say, okay, but really, what's the 10% that really honors what I have to say and how do I show up in the world? The rest of it, is somebody else's opinion, actually, when it comes down to it.
Yes, and it's what worked for them, right?
Yeah.
Most people are teaching what's worked for them. And
Yeah.
so it really becomes an echo chamber, right? It doesn't mean it's going to work for you. And that is, I have done the same. Starting an online business, there were a million people telling me how to do that.
Hmm.
And what I kept coming back to over and over was, how does that align with who I am? And again, as you get into branding and marketing, so many different ways to connect with your audience, or, you've got to follow this formula to say this thing. But what about your authentic voice? But what about the wisdom that you know? What about the
Right.
reason you started the business to begin with? And the hearts that you've already connected to in your audience? You know what they desire.
Hmm.
You know what they long for. Speak to that.
Yeah. I had a guest on, boy, it was maybe 6 months ago, Elizabeth, and you would love it. She said something I really, really liked. She was starting her speaking business, and she went and paid big money, and I think she ended up in Austin, Texas, where you are, to go through a training that she sat through for 3 days where they just fire hosed them with information, and she tried to take copious notes and everything, and then she realized this is ridiculous. There's no way I can retain all this stuff. She goes, "I'm only gonna do 50% of it." And I really like that. She goes, and that became a mantra of hers. I'm going to take in this advice and I'm only going to probably accept maybe 50% of it. The rest of it, I'm going to do my own way. And I think she
I
had a
love
lot of
that.
success doing that. And I'd never heard it articulated that way before, but I really liked it, you
Mm.
know?
Yeah, one of the things that I talk about in storytelling, because so you talked about the story shift. I also have an offer called Story Authority, which is really this beautiful way to understand the story gold mine that lives within you. So it's building out your strategic story vault and recognizing that there isn't just one story, that there are so many stories that you have. And in that offer, I highlight something that I like to call the sovereignty filter. And that's really, you can use it for stories. It also can be used for any area of your life, right? To really say, what is mine to share, right? How does this feel? Is this in alignment with who I am now as I'm sharing this? One of the things I see over and over for a lot of women is they're still sharing stories that were, relevant 15 years ago. But now, as who they are, maybe the story still works, but how they are seeing it and the value in it and the connection points to it have changed, right? And so this ability to have that filter of sovereignty over everything that you're sharing, to actually come back to, let me take this through a series of questions to see how it actually feels for me,
What are
not how
some
it
of those
feels to an
questions?
expert. Well,
Yeah.
exactly what I was saying of,
Yeah.
you know, is this mine to share? Is this something that I feel in integrity with, right? And is this something that, aligns with who I am now, right? Those are a couple of the examples of questions, you know, um, to again take it out of this, here's what I'm supposed to share, right?
Mm-hmm.
I know this will be great for my audience to hear, but if it doesn't align with you, if it's not in integrity, I've heard so many women say they feel overexposed after, they've gone through storytelling, and one of the reasons that they're timid to do it, or they kind of avoid it, is because when they've done it before, they've got these vulnerability hangovers that are not the positive ones. They're actually because they were taught to, share all the whole ugly underbelly of what they were going through, to connect with their audience, and it didn't feel in integrity for them, but they didn't have a barometer because they were just told to do more and more of that, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
this is a way to say, let's pause before you share that story and feel if it's in integrity. But again, like I said, I was using that example because it's in that beautiful offer, but it also is something that can pertain to any area of life, right? I mean,
Yeah.
if we could all pause and say, is this actually mine? Is this how I want to do this? Is this in integrity for me? And does it feel like it's aligned with who I am now in this moment?
Well, and you hear that all the time, from these so-called gurus. You have to be vulnerable, be authentic, be transparent, be vulnerable. And I'm like, yeah, maybe to a point. You definitely want to be authentic, right? And
Mhm,
you don't
mhm.
want to be holding things back from people. But like you said, you've got to have a barometer of that vulnerability of what's comfortable for you to share and what do they really need to know, because sometimes it just gets too maudlin. It's just like, oh
Yes.
God, here's another, vulnerable moment. Okay, great. I get it. Um,
And it needs to be intentional, right? Like
right.
storytelling, having a purpose is really important. And
Hmm.
so if you are sharing something that's incredibly vulnerable, for example, like the moment with my daughter, if I were going to
Yeah.
share that, it probably is going to be speaking about this return to my authenticity and this
Yeah.
new agreement that I've created with myself around not performing, right? Especially given all the context of how we've been taught, not only as women, as men too, to
Well,
perform.
you grew up performing. I mean, and then your
Exactly.
your your first job out of college was performing, right?
Yeah.
And
Yep.
so, and like you said, they came in and they made you up and told you how to talk and how to articulate and
Hmm.
what your hairstyle should be, and they were quaffing you for a celebrity role on news, and it obviously felt inauthentic to you. You did it, of
Hmm.
course, as we all do, to
Yes,
get
we all
through, and
do.
then you have an awakening first. This isn't for me. I'm going to leave this behind. Thank you very much. I got a lot out of it. Let me move on to this
Hmm.
next. And then it sounds like for a couple, 3 years there, as you were kind of trying to figure out, okay, what am I going to do? Then you had this awakening on that beach.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you work with men at all?
A few brave men. But I really do feel a soul connection to awakening women's voices.
Yeah.
I really do feel a deep connection to the ancestry, the history there of women as storytellers that was very much lost when we entered an era of patriarchy and male dominated business and everything else. And so for me, my soul work really lies in working with women
Mm.
specifically.
Yeah. All right. The $1 million story. What is it? How do you find it? And where do you use it?
Well, I'm so glad you're asking about this because I don't believe we only have $1 million story. I believe that the better we become as storytellers, the more that will become apparent to us. So we have multiple $1 million stories, but these are stories that can win over audiences, that can move them in a specific direction, and they become a part of your legacy. They become a part of your leadership that is intrinsically tied to who you are. And so your $1 million stories are those stories that are going to differentiate you. They're the ones that are going to elevate you. They're the ones that show your authority without you having to say, here are all the credentials of why I'm so good at what I do. And they define who you are as a leader simply by showing up and sharing that story with the audience.
Can you walk me through it very quickly to find one of my $1 million stories? What would you ask me to think about so that all of our listeners can think about it too to find their $1 million story?
Yeah. So tell me about tell me about right now. I know that you have this beautiful creation with your AI tool that you've done, the StoryCycle Genie. And I understand that in that you are working with a specific type of leader who is turned off by, the complicated branding. Tell me what it is that is like the biggest transformation you want them to feel by using this. What do you want them to actually experience?
Great question. And it's kind of what you have been talking about in this first 30 minutes here is to help them have their aha moment when they find out what their true brand story is. And when I say brand story, it's not just their business, it's themselves as a leader, what they have brought to it, because that brand story is just a reflection of their own personal / professional brand story, if you will. And what we like to say, Elizabeth, is everyone has an important story to tell. You can feel it. You
Yeah.
just can't find it. And what the
Mm.
StoryCycle Genie ultimately does is helps you find, helps you unearth, helps you reveal that story.
And why is that so important? Why is that so important to you that you help people reveal that story?
Well, I was raised as one of 7 kids. We had a
Mm.
marvelous family. My mother, who was 101, just passed away 3 days ago. So
Oh,
this is
I'm so
very,
sorry.
very raw for me, but very healthy.
Mhm.
All the way up. She had her, mental faculty. She had everything going. Her body just said after 101, you're
Yeah.
done. And
Yeah.
so when we were raised in this brood, this is 7 kids in 9 years. My mom and dad
Mm.
got married late 20s. They were 28 and 29. They had all of us within a decade, basically. And to get heard, you had to raise your hand. You had to out wrestle your brother. You had to out talk your sister. You went through a lot. Very misunderstood. I felt very misunderstood in that. I took a very artful approach to business, with my work. And I've got a music composition degree. I ran my own ad agency. I was in PR. I can't tell you how many times, Elizabeth, my mom and dad, right up to the bitter end, asked me exactly what I did. They never really understood what I did. And my other siblings who are wonderful people would look at me sometimes and like, what in the hell is he doing now? Like, how is that going to work? And it always worked out. And so I think I find that in helping businesses that are misunderstood, both first internally, even by the owner, by the founder, and even their colleagues, the people that come in with the best of intentions to work as hard as they possibly can and be as successful as they possibly can, still not completely understanding the business, why it exists, what the story is. And I can only go back to that my very early days of being a misunderstood Howell as number 5 among 7 kids. And I think I play that forward now, 50 years later, helping businesses to be better understood.
Yeah. And so I would love to explore, if we had all the time in the world, we would explore that idea of being misunderstood that you felt, and maybe some visceral experiences you had around that, and how that has informed and stayed with you and become part of your identity, and how the ability to help businesses and founders become understood is truly your soul work, right? And what it offers you, what it does for them, and then as a result does for you. And to me, there is a beautiful story there that is far more on the emotional side of what the StoryCycle Genie is, that we can see as this very personal angle, but it also is, again, speaking to every person. I know I've been misunderstood. And the idea that when you put that personal angle into why the brand story matters, and really helping these companies and these founders be understood in a way that they never have before, it gives them a lens into why you do what you do that also allows them to have that emotional hook in.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for that. I've never thought about it that way before, or ever talked about my life's work that way before, that is really culminating in the Story Cycle Genie. And I'm curious if you find this in your work too, especially when you're working with your women and some very brave men to help them reveal and find that $1 million story for them. What I've learned and experienced and seen other people experience is this idea of being enthralled. When their story starts materializing before their eyes and they're going, yes, yes, I've never thought about saying it that way, but this is exactly it. It's a very enthralling experience. And one of the definitions, of course, of enthralling is the fascinated attention on something. And isn't that what every brand and every founder and every person really wants, is to command a fascinated attention on their own story, on their own life's work, and on how they help people get what they want out of life?
Absolutely. And I feel like one of the things that we've touched on, but we haven't named, is what made that so powerful, what we just did around your $1 million story, is that it actually hit at an identity level. And to me, a $1 million story requires, it is not a surface level story. It is something that hits at an identity level.
And by identity level, you mean the level of identity of the storyteller. It goes beyond that logic, reasoned, executive functioning brain and dives deep into that soul story.
Yes. Same with my story of the ocean, right? The one that we went through together. You can see how that shifted me on an identity level, and what that provides for the person who is experiencing it is an opportunity to really see themselves in the experience or to connect to an experience that they've had. It gives them an identity level connection to you as the storyteller and to what you're speaking about, what you're leading them into. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is really interesting, and I'll now be curious where this conversation goes, because you obviously bring a lot of heart and soul to your work, and I don't know how much you use artificial intelligence. Of course, we like to call it artful intelligence once you're using the Genie, but we did, of course, run your brand story through the Genie. And feel free to punch me in the nose if any part of that felt inauthentic to you, felt like AI slop, felt like anything that was not really you. What did you think of what you got from your brand assessment and your narrative strategy?
Well, first of all, it's just so cool. I love this tool. I love that I was actually really interested in the assessment and didn't even realize that it had so much more than just the assessment afterwards until today. So for the assessment itself, I actually really loved how it was broken down into the different dimensions, and it could tell me clearly, give me an actual rating of what it thought I was doing well. And, I got 8s and 8.5s and 9s, and I was like, oh, well, I'm very curious about what would bring me to a 10.
On your positioning clarity, it said you got an 8.5 out of 10, which isn't bad. And then the very quick assessment was you have a strong differentiation, but maybe you need some minor title diffusion, which I think is interesting. And what that I think means is maybe just some more clarity on that differentiation.
Yeah, which I love. I'm like, let's see, like, where do we, as I went through it, it didn't feel exactly like my voice, right? So as I went through the audiences, I thought were very spot on. So as we're talking about this, just to make sure everyone is clear, it breaks down into primary audiences. And so it broke down for me 3 primary audiences. And went through each of those in quite a bit of detail about who they are, the challenges they feel, the fears, the frustrations, and the aspirations. And it gave me as well an ABT statement, and for each of the 3 audiences that it identified. So very thorough. Again, the ABT statement for me was not in my voice, so I would have to work with it to make it feel authentically mine. And so that was the biggest thing that I was feeling going through this more in-depth work, was like, I understand, I can see the power of what it's offering, and to make it feel like me, I would have to massage it into place. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's absolutely what it does, because all I did was took your website, gave it to the Genie, and in about 2 minutes, it gave me the assessment. And then in about another 5 minutes, it created the whole brand narrative strategy, as in, this is the way you are currently showing up in the world. But you, as a user, would then work and collaborate with the Genie to say, this isn't quite right. I would say it like this. And with every iteration, it gets smarter about how you show up in the world. That's why we call it artful intelligence. So you are just seeing the very logic-driven part of it by just, it's just looking, it's like, mirror, mirror on the wall, how is my brand showing up for all? This is the way it's currently showing up. And then not in your voice, as you would say, but here are, the main building blocks for your brand narrative structure.
Yes, but I love it. And I really love the part, I love to geek out on archetypes. And so there was, you gave me 3 archetypes, and you gave me brand personality traits. And I loved those pieces. Those were really fun.
And then you felt like that was on. It said your primary archetype is the magician category, and the sub-archetype within that is the alchemist. And seeing how you've got Story Alchemy, that seems to make sense, right?
Yes, it's beautiful. And even the unique value proposition, very simple. I found it was 4 words: elegant authority, unmistakably yours. That was what it said for the unique value proposition. I thought that was beautiful.
Have you ever said that anywhere, or is that just something it cobbled together?
Yes, I have said both of those things in my copy.
But have never put
And
them together as a
right,
UVP?
pulling them together, yeah, for as
Oh.
two sentences. So that was
So
neat to
kind of
see.
inspired you with a potential UVP for your business. Okay, cool.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Well, it's always so much fun to run these, and it ends up being a 14-page report, so it does take you a while, a person to get through it. I know I wanted to ask you about because you deal
yeah.
so much in emotion, and it
Yes.
said your emotional promise, and I've not seen this ever with any and I've run hundreds of
Mm,
brands through the Genie. I've never seen undeniable as an emotional
mm.
promise, and I'm curious how that lands with you.
It's very interesting that you say that because I really sat with that one. And I thought there were other words that it used, like liberated and sovereign. There were a lot of other words that, um, unmistakable, right? There are a lot of words that I thought would were interesting that it could have chosen. And so I'm not convinced that that is the ultimate
Mhm,
emotional promise.
mhm. And then what you would do in the Genie is say, "I like it. I like where you're going with it. I even like the other words you selected, but I'm not
Mhm,
quite sure it's where I want it to be. I want you to consider these thoughts." And you just tell it your thoughts. You don't have to know any prompt engineering. You just talk to it, and then it'll come back and give you 3, 4, 5 different options for that emotional promise. So it'll work with
mm,
you, and it'll
mhm,
say, "Elizabeth, which one do you really like, or which one should we work together on and dive deeper?" And so that's where it helps reveal some gaps, but that inspires you with new ways to authentically think about your brand story without telling you what it is. It's just
mhm.
now saying, here's what I think I'm seeing. What do you think, Elizabeth? And then help us, build the brand brain around this.
Which I think is so fun because if nothing else, the inspiration from this to then, it gives you a different way of thinking about things, even the way it broke down the various outcomes, and it was just so cool to see this way of breaking things down, and then you can really sit with how it could feel perfectly aligned.
Yeah, exactly right. It's not, it's going to probably get you 90% there with the first pass, but then you, as the brand storytelling owner, then collaborate with it. So you get it, and then you can revise it and refine it anytime you want, as you grow and evolve as a thought leader.
Yeah,
Yeah,
very cool though. Thank you
a
for
lot of
doing
fun.
that.
You're welcome. And, you had said something earlier about this sovereignty filter. I can tell you in 570 plus episodes, nobody has ever used the word sovereignty on the show. And why I think it's so interesting is when I was working just recently updating the brand brain around the StoryCycle Genie itself, very meta to work on the Genie, in the Genie, about the Genie. It came up with this idea of story sovereignty. And it's
Mm,
based off of that
mm,
line that I had said earlier. Everybody has an important story to tell. You can feel it, you just can't find it
mm,
until now. And then when you do within the Genie, it becomes story sovereignty. It is your story. It's not hallucinating. It's not bringing in a whole bunch of generalized stuff, from generic slop AI. It is all built about your own specific story and built with you. So you will
mhm,
always have that story sovereignty on, the story cycle Genie, basically.
mm. Very cool. I love that that came
Wow.
up.
Yeah. Fun stuff. Well, where can people learn more about you and maybe even try out some of your offerings?
Yeah, elizabethbrett.com, easiest place to find me, and then, of course, I'm on Instagram at Elizabeth S. Brett.
Elizabeth S. Brett?
Yes,
Did I hear that right? Okay.
you did.
Awesome. And any last parting thoughts for the people, man or woman, out there listening about what they could do right now as they hang up on our episode to start thinking about their $1 million story?
Mm. One of the most fun things to do, one of the things that I realized I had learned to do without even realizing it as a reporter, was to start looking through the eyes of a storyteller. So just start looking around at the things that are happening in your life, at the experiences you're having, at the internal evolution that's always happening within all of us, and start just allowing there to be this playful curiosity around what stories are ripening right now, what stories are getting ready to reveal themselves, and start seeing through those eyes of a storyteller.
That's awesome. Thank you, Elizabeth. I really appreciate you being here.
Yeah, so great to be here, Park. Thank you.
Hey, I told you this was going to be an amazing show, and I hope you really loved what you heard. And if you did, please feel free to share this episode with anyone you know that would benefit from Elizabeth's great $1 million story advice. Now, I hope you'll join me next Monday when we have another amazing guest. His name's Mark Roberge, and he's the co-founder and managing director at Stage 2 Capital. But more than that, he was HubSpot's fourth employee, their very first chief revenue officer. And he's going to share his insights on how to scale your business. You are going to love this episode. He is such a character, and we had so much fun. So until then, remember that the most potent story you'll ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make that one absolutely epic. Thanks so much for listening.